sold as a wife for $4 to pay a debt, but the cowboy turned a forced marriage into freedom. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The outskirts of Lone Mesa looked harsher than usual under the afternoon sun. Dust clung to every face and horse in the crowd, settling on jackets, boots, and the rough wooden rails of the auction corral. The place smelled of sweat, dry earth, and stale tobacco, normal for livestock trading, but today the tension in the air was different. Conversations dropped into low murmurs each time Mara Elson moved, as if the men watching were deciding what she might be worth. Mara stood in the center of the corral with her wrists tied in front of her. The rope wasn't tight, but its presence made her feel smaller than she wanted to be. She tried to keep her face controlled so she wouldn't show how much her hands trembled. She was 25, worn down by months of dealing with her stepbrother's choices, and her body carried the tired weight of someone who had been pushed into decisions she didn't want. Her stepbrother, Owen, leaned against the fence with the casual posture of a man who had already given up on her. He had lost more money than he could repay, and instead of working off the debt, he dragged her here and justified it by reminding her she had no one else who cared. He didn't look bothered as men inspected her from a distance, discussing her as if she were a tool they might purchase. Mara watched him laugh with one of the bidders, and something inside her tightened. Not anger, just a quiet realization that she had reached the end of what she could endure from him. She kept her breathing steady, tracing the ground with her eyes so the crowd wouldn't see the fear tightening her jaw. She thought about the past year, leaving her mother's home after her death, drifting between temporary jobs, and trying to keep Owen from falling deeper into gambling. Every choice she made had led here, and she didn't know how to keep herself from disappearing into whatever life the highest bidder wanted. The corral gate creaked, breaking her concentration. The crowd shifted as a tall man stepped into view. He looked different from the others, not hurried, not loud, not eager to bargain. He walked with the careful pace of someone who weighed every step before taking it. His long coat lifted slightly in the wind, revealing work-worn jeans and boots coated in dust from a long ride. His hat shaded most of his face, but when he stopped at the fence, his eyes lifted just enough to meet hers. Frank called her. She didn't know his name yet, but his presence felt distinct, serious, quiet, and grounded. Mara noticed how he stood, spine straight, shoulders relaxed, hands steady. Not threatening, but not unsure. He looked like a man used to long hours of labor and long stretches of silence. His expression didn't show interest or amusement, only a kind of controlled observation that made her hold her breath. Frank had come to Lone Mesa only because he needed tools and salt for his ranch. He didn't visit town unless he had a purpose, and he didn't linger in places where people try to draw him in a conversation. He lived alone on a wide stretch of land miles from any neighbor, carrying memories that made him avoid trouble whenever he could. His main mission in life was simple: keep the ranch running, stay away from violence, and keep his distance from anything that might pull old wounds to the surface. But today, as he saw a woman being presented like freight, something shifted. He had seen enough mistreatment in past years working cattle trails and mining camps to know where this situation would lead. He didn't plan to involve himself. Yet the moment Mara lifted her chin to hide her fear, he made a decision without speaking it aloud. Owen shouted, $4 clears the debt. Anyone got better? Most of the bidders hesitated, judging whether she was worth a fight. Before anyone answered, Frank reached into his coat, pulled out 4 folded bills, and handed them to Owen. He didn't bother to negotiate. Owen took the money with a greedy grip, surprised by how quickly the trade was made. Frank stepped through the gate. His boots hit the packed dirt with slow, even weight. He took out a small knife and sliced the rope binding her wrists. The blade glinted briefly before he tucked it away. Mara's breath hitched when the rope fell, but Frank didn't touch her. He stepped back as if giving her room to breathe. "You're coming with me," he said, voice low and calm. Mara braced for a catch, some condition, some demand, but he didn't add anything. His tone carried no pressure. She watched his face closely, trying to find a sign of what he wanted. His eyes remained steady, focused but not sharp. Owen waved them off. "Take her. That's paid." Frank ignored him completely. Mara stepped toward the gate with slow, hesitant movements. She had no reason to trust a stranger, yet the alternative was to stay here and wait for another man to bargain for her. She studied Frank again, searching for hidden aggression. She saw none. What she did see was restraint, controlled, deliberate restraint that made her unsure what to expect. Frank led her to his horse, a steady brown mare with a worn saddle. He checked the cinch, then stood aside so she could mount first. She paused, wondering if he was testing her, but his expression didn't change. He simply waited. She climbed up, hands shaking slightly. Frank mounted behind her, but kept enough distance that their bodies barely brushed. His silence was unusual, not cold, but cautious, like a man who had trained himself to speak only when necessary. The horse stepped forward, carrying them away from Lone Mesa. Mara watched the town shrink behind them, the buildings blurring into dusty shapes. She expected Frank to question her, demand obedience, or explain what he intended to do with her. But he kept his gaze forward, shoulders relaxed, guiding the mare with practiced movements. After several long minutes, he finally spoke. "You'll get water when we stop." The simple statement surprised her. No ownership, no threat, just a practical offer. "I can wait," she said softly. "If you need something, say it." His voice carried a quiet firmness that didn't feel harsh. It felt like someone used to managing emergencies with calm commands. They rode across open plains stretching toward a distant ridge. The wind cooled as the sun dipped lower. Mara held the saddle horn tightly, not because she feared falling, but because the quiet between them felt unfamiliar. She wasn't used to being near someone who didn't want to control her. Frank lifted his chin toward the horizon. "Ranch is past that ridge." Mara nodded, unsure whether she felt relief or another layer of uncertainty. She didn't know this man. She didn't know his intentions. But she knew one thing with surprising clarity. The silence coming from him wasn't the silence of a man waiting to strike. It was the silence of someone who lived far from others and liked it that way. As they rode toward the faint outline of the ranch, Mara's shoulders loosened, not from comfort, but from exhaustion. She didn't trust him yet, but she didn't fear him the way she feared the men back in town. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility that her life might not collapse entirely tonight. The trail stretched north in a thin, uneven line across the plains, cutting through tall grass and scattered sagebrush. The sun had dropped low enough to cast longer shadows, and the air cooled just enough to make the ride bearable. Mara kept both hands tight around the saddle horn, her body tense from holding herself upright beside a man she didn't yet understand. Each step the mare took sent a soft thud through her bones, steady but unfamiliar. Frank rode in silence behind her, guiding the horse with small shifts of his knees and reins. She could feel the control in his movements, firm, patient, and careful. He didn't crowd her, not even when the trail narrowed. He adjusted his posture instead, leaving her space so she wouldn't feel cornered. She noticed these things more than she wanted to. After years of anticipating danger, she had learned to read every detail in a man's behavior, and his restraint unsettled her in a way she couldn't categorize. They passed a row of cottonwoods, their leaves rustling lightly in the evening wind. Mara glanced toward the sound, half expecting riders to appear from the trees. Nothing moved except branches swaying above them. She forced her shoulders to relax, but worry lingered. Owen had sold her without shame. If he regretted giving her up, he might come looking. She didn't say that aloud. She didn't know if Frank would care. Frank finally spoke when they reached a flatter stretch of land. "Water break." His voice remained steady, not loud or abrupt, just practical. Mara nodded and swung her leg over the saddle, landing on the ground with stiff feet. Her balance faltered for a moment, and Frank reached out, stopping just short of touching her. When she steadied herself, he lowered his hand without comment. A narrow creek ran beside the trail, the water moving in a thin line over light-colored stones. Frank knelt beside it, filled a tin cup, and handed it to her. Mara hesitated, not because she distrusted the water, but because she still didn't know how to accept anything without wondering what it cost. She studied his face for a sign of impatience or expectation, but his expression stayed calm and unreadable. She drank slowly. The water cooled her throat and eased some of the dryness caused by hours of tension. When she returned the cup, Frank rinsed it, placed it in his saddlebag, and scanned the horizon. "You hurt anywhere?" he asked. The question surprised her. Most men check the mare's condition before caring about who rode it. "My legs are stiff," she said. "I'm not used to long rides. We'll stop again before dark." He stood and checked the horse's hooves, running his hand down each leg with practiced attention. Mara watched him quietly, noticing how he handled the mare with the same patience he had shown her. No sudden movements, no harshness, no unnecessary noise. She found herself wondering if he always lived this way, speaking only when necessary, taking up space without demanding attention, moving like someone who had learned long ago that loudness rarely solved anything. When he finished inspecting the horse, he gestured toward the saddle. "You'll ride in front again. She steps smoother that way." She nodded and climbed up. He mounted behind her, maintaining the same careful distance. The mare resumed her slow, even pace along the creek. After several minutes, Mara finally gathered the courage to ask a question that had been weighing heavily on her. "You didn't know me," she said quietly. "Why step in?" Frank kept his eyes on the trail. Didn't want to watch what would happen if no one did. She waited for more, but he didn't elaborate. The simplicity of his answer struck her harder than any explanation could have. Frank wasn't trying to impress her or gain gratitude. He acted because he couldn't tolerate the alternative. The land began to rise slightly as they approached the ridge. The sky shifted into deeper shades of blue, and the air cooled further. Mara breathed in the scent of sage and dust, grounding herself in the physical world to push back the fear that drifted into her thoughts. She considered her future, whatever shape it had now. Frank hadn't threatened her or claimed her, but she wasn't naive. A man didn't spend money without reason. A man didn't bring a stranger to his property unless he needed something in return. She reminded herself to stay alert, to avoid assuming gentleness meant safety, no matter how calm he seemed. Frank adjusted the reins slightly. "Cabin's over that ridge. We'll reach it before full dark." Mara followed his gaze and saw the faint outline of higher ground ahead. She didn't know what waited on the other side. She didn't know if she could trust him. But the land felt quieter than Lone Mesa, and the threat of drunken bidders was far behind them. As the horse climbed the slope, the wind carried the smell of distant pine. Mara gripped the saddle horn and steadied her breathing. Whatever came next, she would face it with clear eyes, not resignation. Frank's voice cut through the silence once more, level, informative, nothing hidden beneath it. "No one else lives near us. You'll have space." Mara didn't answer immediately. She needed time to understand the meaning of space when she had spent years with none. She let the quiet stretch between them, not as fear, but as something she hadn't felt in a long time, uncertain calm. They crested the ridge together, the fading light casting long shadows over the land below. What she saw there would change the direction of her life, though she didn't know it yet. The ridge sloped downward into a broad stretch of quiet land that looked untouched by the chaos of Lone Mesa. Mara followed the curve of the terrain with her eyes, taking in the wide field of dry grass, the line of cottonwoods along a narrow creek, and a small cabin tucked against a low rise of earth. Smoke drifted from its chimney in a thin, steady line, showing someone had prepared the place before leaving for town. Frank guided the mare down the slope with slow, controlled movements. The cabin grew clearer with each step, thick timber walls, a pitched roof built to handle wind, and a porch with a single wooden chair placed neatly beside the door. A corral sat to the right, where a calm brown mare lifted its head as they approached. The animal didn't react with fear. It simply watched them, ears forward, as if evaluating whether the newcomers posed any threat. Mara felt her pulse quicken. She didn't know what she expected, but the cabin was simple, quiet, lived in but not neglected. She braced herself anyway. A cabin didn't need locks to become a prison. Frank slowed the horse to a stop near the porch. "You can get down," he said, stepping off first to steady the mare. Mara lowered herself carefully. Her legs shook from the long ride, but she kept her face steady. Frank took the reins and nodded toward the cabin. "Go ahead. Door isn't stuck." She hesitated at the threshold. Going inside felt like crossing into a place she couldn't leave, yet staying outside meant standing in the open with no direction. After a brief pause, she pushed the door open. The interior surprised her. It was small but orderly. A wooden table sat near the center with two chairs pushed neatly beneath it. A bed was positioned against the far wall, covered in folded blankets. Tools hung in precise rows, each one placed with purpose. The fireplace held faint embers, and a stack of split logs waited beside it. The room smelled faintly of pine and smoke, not sweat or alcohol or anything that indicated danger. For the first time since morning, Mara's shoulders loosened slightly. Frank stepped in after a moment, carrying an armful of firewood. He didn't close the door behind him. He let it stay open as he crossed the room. He set the wood down, worked the tinder with quiet efficiency, and coaxed a warm flame back to life. Mara watched his movements, each one steady, unhurried, and grounded. "You can take the bed," he said, adjusting the fire. "I'll use the chair." She blinked. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he replied without looking up. His tone wasn't defensive or emotional. It was simply factual, as if giving her the bed wasn't a gesture, just a decision he had already made. He hung his hat on a peg near the door, and for the first time she saw his full face in the firelight. His features were strong, but not harsh. Lines along his eyes suggested years of long work and little rest. His expression held no impatience, only a kind of quiet focus she didn't understand. Mara stepped farther into the room, unsure what to do with her hands. She scanned every detail, the small cupboard beside the stove, the simple plates stacked inside, the worn rug by the bed. She kept expecting a hidden threat, something out of place, some signal he wasn't what he seemed. Instead, she found nothing but a life built around work and solitude. Frank opened a small storage cabinet and set 2 tin plates on the table. "I'll fix something to eat," he said. "Sit if you want." The permission rather than command unsettled her. She sat slowly, feeling the chair's warmth from the fire. Her mind raced through possibilities. Why he bought her, what he expected, whether this calm was temporary. She had lived too long expecting the world to turn sharp without warning. Frank placed a pot over the fire, poured in water, and added dried vegetables and a small piece of salted meat. The smell eventually filled the room, simple but comforting. While it cooked, he checked the windows and adjusted the shutters. Not to lock her in, she realized, but to keep the wind from blowing smoke back into the room. Mara watched every move. Her heartbeat steadied with each detail she didn't expect. When the stew was ready, Frank set a bowl in front of her. He took his own bowl and sat across the table. He didn't stare at her. He didn't rush his food. He ate with slow, thoughtful bites, as someone who rarely shared meals. Mara lifted the spoon. The heat soothed her throat in a way she hadn't felt in months. She glanced at Frank. "Why does a man like you live out here alone?" He set his spoon down. "Grew up moving from job to job. Liked this land best. Built the cabin. Stayed." His answer gave no details, yet his voice carried a weight that hinted at years he didn't want to revisit. She considered her next question carefully. "And why bring me here?" He met her eyes for the first time since they sat down. His gaze was steady, not invasive. "Didn't want to leave you there. That's all. Enough reason for me." She didn't know how to respond. She expected ownership. She expected threats. She expected every version of control she had known. But this man sitting across from her, quiet, tired, firm, seemed to operate on rules she didn't recognize. He finished eating, stood, and placed his bowl near the wash basin. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "We'll figure out tomorrow when the day starts." He turned down the fire slightly, pulled a blanket over the chair he intended to sleep in, and checked the door, not locking it, just closing it against the cold. Mara looked at the bed, at the folded blankets, at the flicker of light on the walls. For the first time since her mother died, She would sleep without bracing for footsteps. She lay down cautiously, waiting for fear to return. But the cabin stayed quiet. Frank settled into the chair, his breathing slow and steady. Outside, the wind brushed against the eaves, carrying no threats, no voices calling her name. Inside, the room held only warmth, the faint crackle of fire, and the steady sound of a man who had saved her without demanding anything in return. It wasn't safety yet, but it was the first place that didn't feel like a trap. Mara woke before sunrise, unsure for a moment where she was. The cabin's quiet replaced the noise she usually braced for in unfamiliar rooms. No footsteps, no door slams, no muttering threats. Only a faint crackle from the last embers in the fireplace and the steady breathing of Frank asleep in the chair. He had kept his word. He hadn't moved closer during the night, hadn't hovered over her, hadn't watched her while she slept. His presence stayed contained in the space he chose, solid but not intrusive. She pushed the blanket back slowly, careful not to wake him. The wooden floor felt cool under her feet as she crossed to the basin and washed her face with the cold water left from the day before. Her reflection in the small, dented tin mirror showed a woman who looked tired but not hunted. That alone made her chest tighten with something close to relief. Frank stirred when she set the cloth down. He blinked once, adjusting to the dim light. "Morning," he said with the quiet tone of someone used to long days beginning early. "Morning," she replied, unsure how to behave around a man who didn't expect immediate obedience. He stood, stretching his back carefully before heading to the stove. He added wood, coaxed the fire to life, and set a tin pot of water on the grate. Mara watched him, noticing how he moved with certainty but not urgency. He didn't expect her to serve him. He didn't look to see whether she was preparing food. He simply handled what needed to be done. She stepped forward. "I could take over if you want." He glanced at her, not surprised by the offer. "If you're comfortable with it." Comfort, not duty, not obligation, not fear. She nodded and took the spoon from the counter. She added dried beans and a small amount of ground meal to the pot, stirring as the water warmed. Frank didn't hover or correct her. He used the time to pull on his coat and check the latch on the window. Every movement he made kept space between them, not out of avoidance, but respect. When the meal was ready, she served the bowls and placed one in front of him. He accepted it with a short nod and sat at the table. Mara took the other seat, her posture stiff at first. Eating across from someone was something she hadn't done without tension for years. They ate quietly. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like part of the place itself. After breakfast, Frank grabbed a bucket and gestured toward the door. "Need to check the mare? You can join if you want." She followed him outside. The air was crisp with morning chill, and the ground still carried marks from the wind the night before. The corral stood beside the barn, its rails straight and well-maintained. The mare greeted them with a gentle huff. Frank handed Mara the brush. "She's calm, just slow strokes along the neck and back." Mara approached the horse carefully, smoothing her hand along the animal's warm coat before beginning to brush. The mare leaned into the movement, as if grateful for attention. Mara felt her own breathing settle into a steady rhythm. While she worked, Frank checked the trough, repaired a loose rail, and spread fresh hay. He worked with quiet efficiency, no wasted movements. He didn't rush her or comment on her technique. Every action he took was measured, focused on the task rather than on her presence. When she finished brushing the mare, Frank looked over. "You did good." The simple acknowledgement hit harder than praise. It wasn't flattery, just truth stated plainly. They moved on to other chores. Frank split logs while Mara swept the porch and organized the tools by the cabin wall. She found herself falling into a rhythm, task to task, movement to movement, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Work done without fear felt different. It felt steady. Around midday, Frank took a break and leaned against the porch railing. Mara stood beside him, keeping a small but comfortable distance. "You don't have to do all this," he said. "If you need rest, take it." She looked out at the open land, the wide stretch of grass moving lightly in the breeze. "It's better to stay busy. Makes my mind quiet." He gave a slow nod, understanding more than he said. Same for me. The afternoon passed with more small tasks. Frank adjusted the barn door hinges while Mara organized the shelves inside the cabin. She noticed the orderliness of his supplies. Nothing fancy, everything functional. Each item had a place, suggesting someone who kept his life simple because complexity brought memories he didn't want. By evening, the sky turned orange and shadows stretched long across the yard. Mara cooked again, this time adding bits of dried pepper she found in a small container. Frank tasted the meal, raised an eyebrow at the change, and nodded with approval. She felt her chest warm at the reaction. After they ate, Frank placed his bowl in the wash basin. Tomorrow we'll check the northern fence line. It's a long walk, only if you feel up to it. I'll go, she said, without hesitation. He studied her for a moment, not doubting, but confirming she meant it. All right. The fire crackled behind them, warming the room. Frank pulled the blanket onto the chair again, readying his sleeping space. Mara watched him, realizing something important. He wasn't acting for a benefit. He was simply living the way he always had, quiet, deliberate, careful not to harm. That night, as she settled into the bed, she didn't wait for fear to return. She let the quiet settle over her, and for the first time, she felt a small shift inside her. Not safety yet, but something close. Something that hinted the cabin might become more than a refuge. It might become a place she could belong. The next morning began with a thin line of pale light slipping across the cabin floor. Mara awoke to the faint scrape of metal as Frank sharpened a small knife near the table. The sound was steady, controlled, not rushed or aggressive. She sat up slowly, brushing her hair back, and he stopped long enough to glance over his shoulder. You slept some, he said. His tone wasn't casual. It was observational, the way a man notes changes without prying. A little, she answered, pulling the blanket aside. Frank finished his task, wiped the blade clean, and set it in its sheath on the shelf. He handed her a cup of warm water he must have heated before she woke. Drink before we leave, he said. Fence line's a long walk. Mara wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth steady her. She drank slowly and noticed Frank checking his coat pockets, twine, a folded cloth, a small tin of nails. He prepared for the day with quiet efficiency, the same kind of focus she had begun to recognize as his armor. They stepped outside into a cool morning. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the yard. Frank secured the cabin door and nodded toward the narrow path leading north. Mara followed him, adjusting her pace to match his. The grass brushed softly against their boots, and a light breeze carried the scent of the creek. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just practical. They needed breath for the distance. After they passed the first stretch of open land, Mara finally gathered the courage to speak about something she had been turning over in her mind. You haven't asked me anything about before, she said. Frank's pace slowed slightly, though he didn't stop walking. It's yours to say, he answered, not mine to pull out of you. His words sounded simple, but they struck deeper than he knew. She had spent years with men who treated her silence as an obstacle to break, not a boundary to respect. They reached the first fence post, one that leaned slightly to the left. Frank knelt, adjusted the base, and hammered the soil with a heavy stone. Mara held the rail steady as he worked. The teamwork came naturally, as if the past days had already built a rhythm between them. Once the post was straight again, Frank stood and brushed dirt from his hands. He looked at her with quiet expectation, not for answers, but for whatever she wanted to say next. She took a slow breath. He didn't drag me into that auction because of anything I did, she said. He did it because he lost too much money and thought I'd be easier to trade than working off the debt. Frank's jaw tightened, not with anger aimed at her, but with the kind a man feels when he sees something wrong and cannot undo it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix the moment. He let her speak. I kept thinking he'd stop before it went that far, she continued. But he never had any intention of protecting me. I was just a way out. Frank rested his hand lightly on a fence post, grounding himself. People like him don't care who they hurt. They care what they can get away with. His voice held no heat, just a truth he had learned long before she arrived in his life. They walked to the next section of fence. The path narrowed, forcing them to walk closer together. Mara didn't feel trapped by the closeness. Frank kept his arms relaxed, giving her room while still staying near enough to signal she wasn't alone. At the second post, Frank inspected a frayed piece of twine. "This needs replacing," he murmured and handed her a fresh strip. She tied it, fingers trembling slightly. He noticed but didn't comment. When she stepped back, she spoke again, softer this time. "You paid the money. Most men would say I owe them something for that." Frank finally looked directly at her. His voice stayed calm, but there was no uncertainty in it. "I didn't buy you. I paid to stop what was happening. That's all. But you brought me here," she said. "Better here than where you were." Mara swallowed hard. His logic was simple, but it carried a weight that affected her more than any promise would have. They moved on, step by step, checking each section of fence until they reached the final post near a cluster of boulders. The land opened wide from there, giving a clear view of the hills to the east. Mara stood beside Frank, breathing in the cold air. Her chest felt tight from saying more than she had in months. He straightened his coat and said quietly, "If you ever want to leave, you can. I won't stop you." She blinked, taken off guard. "Why say that now?" "Because I want you to know your life isn't something I get to control." The sentence hit deep, too deep. For a moment, she couldn't speak. No one had ever stated her freedom so plainly. Frank turned his eyes toward the ridge, scanning the horizon, then continued walking back toward the cabin. Mara stepped beside him, matching his pace again. As they approached the yard, she felt the air inside her chest shift. Not exactly relief, not exactly trust, but a new kind of clarity. This man wasn't waiting for obedience. He wasn't waiting for repayment. He wasn't waiting for gratitude. He was waiting for her to choose her own direction. For the first time in years, she felt the faint possibility of choosing something other than survival. She felt the possibility of choosing a life. The following afternoon carried a warmer wind, the kind that moved dust in slow spirals across the yard and rattled the edges of the corral. Mara had been brushing the mare for nearly 20 minutes when she noticed something shift in the distance, a faint rise of dust far beyond the creek. At first she thought it was wind catching loose soil, but the motion stayed steady. A rider, moving fast. Her hand froze mid-stroke. The mare flicked an ear, sensing her tension. Frank stepped out of the barn at that exact moment, wiping his palms on a rag. He followed her line of sight, eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't need her to explain what she feared. The posture of her shoulders told him everything. "You know him?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "Owen doesn't leave things alone." Frank didn't sigh. He didn't curse. He simply folded the rag once, set it on a barrel, and walked toward the porch. His pace didn't quicken, but the calmness in it sharpened the air around them. Mara moved closer to the cabin without thinking, her instincts pulling her behind the only barrier available. The rider grew clearer, her stepbrother, hunched forward, gripping the reins tightly. His horse looked overworked, sweat soaking the neck. Owen slowed only when he reached the open yard, eyes flicking between Frank and Mara with something close to irritation rather than concern. He dismounted with a sloppy swing of his leg, nearly losing balance. "You think you could just take her?" he snapped, pointing toward Mara. That sale wasn't final. Frank stood on the porch step, one hand resting lightly on the railing. "You accepted the money," he said. His tone was even, not defensive. "You walked away. That doesn't mean she's yours," Owen spat. "She's my blood. I decide where she goes." Mara felt her lungs tighten. Owen's voice had always carried a threat under every sentence, and hearing it again dragged old tension back into her spine. She stepped behind Frank, not fully hidden, but shielded enough to steady herself. Frank didn't turn around. He didn't move toward his gun. He didn't raise his voice. "She's not property," he said quietly. "She stays because she wants to." Owen scoffed. "She doesn't get to choose." Frank stepped off the porch. His boots hit the ground with deliberate weight, closing the distance by only a few steps. He didn't show anger. He didn't show fear. He showed something more controlled. Resolve, plain and unmistakable. "You're not taking her," Frank said. Not now. Not later. Owen's jaw tightened, but he still tried to push forward. I'll take her by force if I have to. Frank finally adjusted his stance, shifting just slightly, enough to make his presence feel larger. He wasn't threatening violence, but the certainty in his posture made the risk clear. Get back on your horse, he said. Ride out. Don't bring trouble here. Owen looked between them, first at Frank's unwavering expression, then at Mara's steady gaze. Something in his confidence cracked. He pulled his coat straight, muttering under his breath, then grabbed the reins. This isn't finished, he said. Frank didn't flinch. It is. Owen mounted clumsily and turned his horse around. He cast one more angry look over his shoulder, then kicked the animal into a quick trot. Dust rose behind him as he rode away, shrinking into a speck against the open land. When he was finally gone, the yard went still again. Frank exhaled once, the only sign of tension he had allowed himself. Mara stepped forward, unsure whether to speak. He glanced at her, the calm in his eyes returning. You all right? He asked. She nodded, though her chest felt tight. I didn't think he'd come this soon. He won't try that again, Frank said. He only came to test what he could get away with. Mara studied his face. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't seeking gratitude. He was stating what he believed and what he intended to uphold. You don't owe me protection, she said softly. I'm not doing it out of debt, he replied. Some things are just wrong. That's enough reason. His words settled deep. They weren't grand or emotional, but they carried more weight than anything she had heard in a long time. Frank walked to the barn to finish the work he had started, pausing only once to look back at her. If he returns, I'll handle it, he said. You won't face him alone. Mara stood in the yard long after he stepped inside, her heartbeat slowly returning to a normal rhythm. She wasn't used to being defended without conditions. She wasn't used to someone standing between her and danger because they believed it was the right thing to do. The land around the cabin felt different now, not just quiet but protected. For the first time, she began to consider that staying here wasn't only about safety. It might be the beginning of belonging. The evening settled slowly over the ranch, stretching long shadows across the yard and softening the lines of the hills in the distance. The air had cooled enough for the scent of pine to drift faintly from the ridge, and smoke rose from the chimney in a steady line as the fire inside warmed the small cabin. Mara stood on the porch for several minutes after finishing her chores, unsure how to approach the conversation she knew had to happen. Frank was inside, stacking cut logs near the stove. His movements remained steady, but the set of his shoulders showed the weight of the day. The encounter with Owen hadn't shaken him in the obvious ways. No anger, no pacing, no restless gestures. But Mara could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the way he exhaled slower than usual. He wasn't afraid. He was thinking through every detail, planning for outcomes he didn't voice. She stepped into the cabin, closing the door quietly behind her. Frank glanced up, giving her a brief nod before returning to the final log. The firelight cast warm color across his face, softening the sharp angles. Mara felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from a strange mixture of gratitude and confusion. You don't have to worry about him tonight, Frank said, placing the last log in the basket. He won't come back in the dark. He's not that bold. That isn't what's keeping me up, she replied. He looked at her fully, waiting, not pushing, not assuming, just letting her decide what came next. Mara crossed the room slowly and sat at the table. I want to understand why you keep helping me, she said. Men don't do things like that without wanting something in return. Frank removed his coat, hung it on the peg beside the door, and pulled out the chair opposite her. He sat with careful posture, leaning his forearms lightly on the table. I'm not most men, he said calmly. That doesn't answer it. He considered this, then nodded once. Fair enough. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. Mara watched him, try to read whether he was searching for the right words or deciding if he should speak at all. I've seen enough harm done to people who had no way to stop it, he said finally. I'm not letting that happen under my roof. That doesn't make me your responsibility. No, he agreed, but it makes the situation something I won't ignore. She lowered her eyes to the table, tracing the faint grain lines with her fingertips. I don't understand why that matters to you. Frank didn't shift in his seat. Because nobody stepped in for my mother, he said. His voice held no tremble, no theatrics, just fact. She was stuck with a man who hit her every time he lost money or came home drunk. Nobody helped her. Not once. I swore I'd never stand by and watch something similar if I could stop it. His past wasn't something he wore on the surface, but now she could see how it shaped every controlled movement, every cautious silence, every deliberate choice he made. His restraint wasn't cold, it was learned. His calm wasn't attachment, it was survival. Mara's throat tightened. You don't think I'll cause you trouble? If trouble was my concern, I wouldn't have opened the gate for you, he said. I'm more interested in whether you feel like you can breathe here. That sentence made Mara's hands freeze against the table. No one had ever asked her that. Not directly, not indirectly, not even in implied form. Breath was something she'd learned to do quietly, carefully, so she wouldn't draw attention. The idea that someone cared whether she could breathe in peace pulled something deep inside her chest. I don't know how to answer that, she whispered. Then take your time. Frank stood, not dismissing her, just giving her space. He went to the stove, lifted the pot of leftover stew, and poured warm portions into 2 bowls. Mara watched this simple routine play out, his steady grip, the quiet clink of metal, the soft release of steam rising into the air. Each small detail grounded her in ways she didn't expect. He placed a bowl in front of her and sat again. They ate quietly for a few minutes. The fire crackled. The wind brushed against the shutters. Mara's thoughts churned with questions she had never dared to voice before, but one finally escaped. What happens now, she asked. Frank swallowed a bite before answering. You stay as long as you want. That's all. What if Owen comes back? I'll handle him, Frank said. His tone didn't rise or harden. It stayed level, as if he were stating a chore on tomorrow's list. He won't get near you again. Mara felt her breath hitch. The certainty in his voice wasn't loud, but it carried more weight than shouting ever could. Why do you trust me enough to let me stay? She asked. Frank shook his head. This isn't about trust. Not yet. Trust takes time. What I'm offering is a chance to live without looking over your shoulder. She looked down at her hands, fingers curling around the warm bowl. And what do you want from me in return? He leaned back in his chair, brow lowering slightly. Not in anger, but in thought. Nothing you don't choose to give, he said. I don't want obedience. I don't want debt. I don't want fear in this house. She stared at him, unsure if she should believe what she heard. Her whole life had taught her that every kindness carried a hidden hook. But Frank's face didn't shift, didn't falter, didn't reveal anything other than steady certainty. You're not here because I bought you, he continued. You're here because you needed somewhere else to go. If you decide to leave one day, I won't stop you. Mara's breath trembled at the thought. Leaving, staying, choices she had never owned. Do you want me to stay? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Frank didn't look away. Only if it's what you want to. The sentence sat between them like an anchor. Heavy, honest, impossible to misinterpret. Mara felt the tension in her chest loosen in a way she hadn't expected. Something inside her settled. Not fully, not completely, but enough for the first root of calm to form. She pushed her bowl aside and rested her palms lightly on the table. I want to see what a life looks like without running. Frank nodded, slow and deliberate. Then you'll see it here. The fire glowed against the walls, casting steady light across the room. Outside, the wind shifted directions, brushing against the cabin in a quiet, passing sweep. Inside, something shifted too, something small but unmistakably real. Mara realized this wasn't a temporary stop. Not anymore. This was the first place where staying felt like a choice, not a sentence. And Frank understood that better than anyone. Morning settled over the ranch with a thin sheet of fog clinging to the ground, softening the edges of the corral and blurring the horizon. Mara stepped onto the porch wrapped in her shawl, feeling the cold bite through the thin fabric. Frank was already outside, carrying a bucket toward the barn with a steady pace. She watched him for a moment, taking in how naturally he moved across the yard, as if the land remembered him and adjusted around his steps. He glanced back when he heard the door close. "You're up early. I couldn't sleep much." He nodded. "Bad dreams, or just thinking?" "Thinking," she replied. "Mostly about yesterday." Frank didn't push for details. He simply set the bucket down by the trough and motioned for her to join him. She walked across the frosted grass, her boots crunching quietly beneath her feet. The smell of damp earth mixed with old hay drifted from the barn, and the mare inside gave a soft nicker as they approached. "She remembers you," Frank said as he opened the stall. Mara brushed the mare's neck with gentle strokes, feeling the warmth of its coat spread into her hands. She had grown used to the animal's presence, the quiet acceptance it offered without question. Frank filled the trough, checked the feed, and inspected the stall door hinge with practiced eyes. "You fix everything before it breaks," Mara said. "Try to," he answered. "Breaks cost more time." His response wasn't philosophical. It was practical, lived, and familiar. That was one of the things she had learned about Frank. He didn't say what he didn't mean, and he didn't mean what he didn't live. After tending the mare, they walked toward the creek. Overnight, moisture had gathered into small beads on the tall grass. Mara bent down, running her fingers lightly over the cool blades. She hadn't felt water like this in years, not water she didn't have to steal, bargain for, or fear losing. Frank pointed to the ridge. "Fence needs checking again. Yesterday's wind might have loosened the top rails." Mara nodded, ready to help without being told how. The walk up the ridge had become familiar. They took the same path, stepping over the same rocks, brushing past the same low branches. But this morning felt different, quieter, heavier in a thoughtful way. The sun broke slowly through the fog, revealing the land in gradual layers. Mara's breath rose in small clouds, dissolving before the air warmed again. "Does it ever get busy out here?" she asked. "Not unless trouble goes looking for a place to hide," he said. She shot him a quick look. "Do you think Owen will come again?" Frank lifted a fallen branch from the trail and tossed it aside. He rode off angry but not confident. Men like him act when they feel bold. Yesterday took that out of him for a while. And after a while, "I'll be ready." Mara didn't press further. She trusted his assessment, not because she believed him invincible, but because he never spoke carelessly. If he said he'd watch for danger, he would. When they reached the fence line, Frank crouched to examine a rail pushed slightly out of place. "Wind did it," he said. "Nothing more." Mara held the rail steady while he repositioned the post and hammered the soil firm with a flat stone. Their hands brushed once, brief, accidental, but enough for her breath to hitch. Frank didn't comment. He just adjusted his grip and kept working. After they finished repairing the section, Frank stood and scanned the horizon. Mara followed his gaze. The land stretched in every direction, wide, open, and quiet. She had lived most of her life wanting to escape enclosed rooms and controlling hands. Here, the sky alone felt like a shield. "You thinking something?" Frank asked. "I'm trying to understand what you get out of all this," she said. "All what?" "Helping me. Letting me stay. Fixing fences with someone who showed up with nothing but dust on her shoes." Frank rested his hands on his hips, considering her words with that steady seriousness he never faked. "I don't need anything from you," he said. "Not work, not debt, not thanks." "Then what keeps me here?" "You." The single word landed heavier than she expected. He continued, voice even. "You're not a burden. You're not trouble. You're a person who needed space to get her feet under her. The house feels less empty now. That's enough." Mara looked away toward the distant cottonwoods, her throat tight. She didn't know how to respond. Not because she didn't believe him, but because she did. They walked back toward the cabin in silence. When they reached the porch, Frank removed his gloves, brushing dirt off the palms. "You hungry?" he asked. "Honestly, yes. I'll get something started." Inside, he prepared food while Mara swept the floor and straightened the blankets. She caught herself humming quietly, a habit she hadn't had since childhood. When she realized it, she stopped abruptly. "You can keep going," Frank said without turning from the stove. Sounded nice. She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's just something I used to do. Nothing wrong with that." He set a pot over the fire and handed her a knife to chop dried vegetables. They worked side by side, moving around each other without stumbling. At one point, she reached for salt at the same time he did. Their fingers touched lightly. This time, neither pulled away quickly. After the meal, Frank opened a narrow cabinet and retrieved a small wooden box. He placed it on the table, sliding it toward her. "You can use what you need from inside," he said. "Thread, needles, a bit of cloth. Figured you might want to fix your shawl." Mara opened the lid. The box held neatly arranged sewing tools, clean and well-kept. She lifted a spool of thread slowly, surprised at how carefully he had put the materials together. "You kept all this? Handy for fixing clothes," he said. "Or blankets, or whatever needs mending." She traced the edge of the box. "You trust me with it?" "It's a box, Mara," he replied. "You aren't going to hurt me with a needle." She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She began stitching her shawl while Frank cleaned the dishes. The fire warmed the room, casting soft hues across the walls. Outside, the wind quieted, giving the cabin an unusual stillness. When the shawl was finished, she draped it over her shoulders, letting the warm cloth settle against her skin. "Looks better now," Frank said. "It feels like mine again." The sentence lingered between them. She didn't just mean the shawl. She meant the feelings settling inside her chest, slow, careful, growing. Later, as the sky darkened, Mara stood near the doorway. Frank moved the chair closer to the fire, ready for another night in his chosen spot. "Frank," she said quietly. He paused. "Yeah, I'm not planning to leave." He studied her face for several seconds, not searching for lies, just letting the meaning settle. "All right," he said. "Then we'll figure out what staying looks like for both of us." Mara felt her chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with a deep, steady warmth she didn't yet have a name for. The cabin, once a strange refuge, now felt like a place where she could build something real. And Frank, steady as the land itself, felt like someone who would hold the line with her rather than against her. In the glow of the fire, she understood something she hadn't dared to consider before. This wasn't temporary anymore. This was the beginning of a life they were shaping side by side, quietly, steadily, and without fear. The next morning brought a rare stillness to the land. The sky spread wide and unbroken above the ranch, washed in soft blue, and the air carried a calm that made the world feel paused. Mara stepped out onto the porch, hugging her shawl around her shoulders. The quiet wasn't unsettling. It felt like the land itself was waiting for something to be decided. Frank stood near the corral, tightening a rope along the top rail. He worked with a focus that came naturally to him, steady and patient. When he noticed her approaching, he lowered his hands, giving her his full attention. "You slept?" he asked. "Enough," she answered, though her thoughts had kept her awake longer than usual. She moved to the rail, resting her hands on the smooth wood. "I've been thinking about yesterday and everything before that." Frank didn't interrupt. He leaned one hip against the corral, letting her speak at her own pace. "My life hasn't belonged to me in a long time," she said. "Every decision was about surviving someone else's choices. I kept waiting for the next problem, the next command, the next reason to run." Frank's brow lowered slightly, not in judgment, but in a quiet understanding that seemed to reach deeper than words. Mara continued, "You didn't ask for anything when you brought me here. You didn't set rules. You didn't expect me to earn my place. You let me breathe. And now she paused, searching for clarity. "Now I want to build something that's mine." Frank straightened slightly, sensing the shift in her tone. "You don't owe me an explanation for staying." "I know," she said, "but I want to give one." She stepped closer so he could hear her clearly. "I'm not here because I have nowhere else to go. I'm here because I choose this. I choose the quiet. I choose the work. I choose the safety you've given without asking for anything." Frank's jaw tightened the way it always did when emotions pushed too close to the surface. He looked away for a moment, then back to her. "I only wanted you to feel like your life could be your own." "It does," she said softly. "More than it ever has." A long breath left him. Not relief exactly, but something grounded. "Then we'll take the days as they come," he said. Mara hesitated, then stepped closer. "I want more than that," she said quietly. "I want stability. I want a home that isn't temporary. I want a life that holds steady even when the past tries to pull me back. She held his gaze, unflinching. And I want it with you. Frank blinked once, slow, controlled, absorbing each word. The silence stretched, not in discomfort, but in weight. Then he moved closer, careful and deliberate. "You're sure?" he asked. "Yes," she said without wavering. "You're the first person who's given me space to choose anything. Let me choose this." Frank let out a controlled breath, one that seemed to soften something long locked behind his ribs. "If you want a life here," he said, "then it won't be half committed. This place can be ours. Not mine with you in it, ours." Mara's chest warmed, steady and grounded. "Then let it be ours." Frank stepped fully toward her, leaving no uncertainty between them. "Marriage is my way of making things clear," he said. "Not out of expectation, not out of obligation, but because it marks a life built together, not side by accident." Mara felt her throat tighten. "I want that," she said. "Not because you bought me, not because anyone expects it, but because you're the one place my life feels steady." Frank nodded, and there was a faint shift in his expression, something small, almost lost beneath the quiet strength he carried, but unmistakably warm. "Then we'll marry today," he said. "No fuss, no crowd, just a truth spoken plainly." A weight lifted from her shoulders, not a burden set aside, but the release that comes when every direction ahead finally feels safe. They prepared quietly. Frank changed into a clean shirt, plain but well kept, one she hadn't seen him wear before. Mara washed her face, combed her hair, and mended a tear in her dress with careful stitches. The simple act of preparing for the moment made everything feel more real. Frank tied the mare to the fence, not because they needed to ride anywhere, but because he wanted the animal to witness the ceremony, something he had never said but Mara understood. The mare had been the first living thing besides Frank to welcome her. They stood a few feet from the porch where the ground leveled and the morning light shone evenly across the yard. Frank positioned himself in front of her, his posture straight but not rigid. "You ready?" he asked. "More than ready," she said. Frank cleared his throat, searching for the right words. Not flowery phrases, not rehearsed vows, but something grounded in truth. "I don't give promises lightly," he began. "I've lived alone most of my life because I didn't know how to share a home without risking what I had left. But you've changed that. You make this place feel like it should have always had more than one chair, more than one voice." Mara felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back, wanting to see him clearly. Frank continued, "I want to build something steady with you. Work beside you. Protect you without ownership. Share burdens without taking away your choices. If you marry me, that's what it means." Mara stepped closer. Her voice stayed strong. "I've lived through years of being told what I am and where I belong. With you, I've learned what it feels like to choose something for myself. You've given me safety without taking freedom. You've shown me patience I didn't know existed. If I marry you, it's because this life, this ranch, this cabin, this silence finally feels like home." Frank lowered his head slightly, a gesture of acceptance rather than hesitation. "Then say it." "I will marry you," she said. "Here, now." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small ring carved from smooth wood. Mara hadn't seen him make it, but she recognized the work, his precise hands shaping something meant to last. He slid it gently onto her finger. "This is yours," he said, "not a symbol of being taken, a symbol of choosing." Mara placed her hand over his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat beneath her palm. "Then this life is ours." The moment didn't need witnesses. It didn't need grand gestures. It was built from truth spoken plainly, exactly as he had promised. They spent the rest of the day settling into their decision as naturally as they had fallen into daily routines. Frank reinforced the barn door for winter. Mara organized the shelves inside the cabin, making room where she had once kept her belongings packed tight as if she might have to leave without warning. Now, there was no leaving. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, Frank stepped onto the porch and watched Mara light the oil lamp inside. The warm glow spread through the cabin, turning it into a place that looked lived in, not by one person, but by two. When Mara joined him outside, He reached for her hand without hesitation. She laced her fingers with his, her breath steady and sure. "This land might not be easy," Frank said, "but it's ours now." She rested her head lightly against his shoulder. Hard isn't the same as dangerous. Not anymore. For the first time since she had arrived, Mara felt something settle inside her. A deep, unwavering peace that didn't rely on hope but on truth. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. In the quiet of the evening, standing beside the man who had turned $4 into freedom, she understood what her life had become. Not borrowed, not threatened, not conditional, chosen, and chosen deeply. Frank tightened his hand around hers as the last light faded, sealing the life they had agreed to build together, steady, quiet, and wholly theirs.